Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here with another splendid Clockwork steampunk story for you. This one's by 69 a Porcupine, called Clockwork Sorcerer. The Honourable Simon Arthur Abbott was late. This would come as no surprise to his sister Vittoria, who lectured him, or even his father, the Vicomte of Market Street, who would simply nod understandingly and ask him to straighten the bookshelves. Knowing his father, it would be the music section of the bookstore, in a heartfelt attempt to convince him to pick up his flute again. Simon would prefer a section rather more interesting, like the mechanics of steam power or the ethical dilemmas of owning clockwork servants. Simon put on speed as he came to the Market Street bookshop. Through the window he could see Vittoria behind the counter of the store's small cafe. The cafe was, as usual, stuffed with customers. Many were young men, hoping for a glimpse or a word from his sister. In their crisply starched collars and jewel-toned waistcoats, they postured and preened, like peacocks on the prowl for the prettiest mate. With her porcelain doll looks that hid a deep well of inner strength, Vittoria had long been declared an uncomparable beauty by the mothers of the aristocracy. As Simon watched through the window, Vittoria flitted back and forth, flirting with one suitor than another, as she charmed them into buying ever more cakes, sweets, and expensive coffee. Spread among the crowd were the clockwork maids and footmen of the aristocratic houses and their charges, children with pocket money hoping to buy a bag of toffee or a small taste of rich hot cocoa imported from the farthest realms of the empire. But as he closely examined each of the servants, Simon caught sight of the butler from the Duchy of Bond Street. The butler was the latest in mechanical engineering, and rumour had it he could go 4 hours without being wound. The Duchess could never resist an opportunity to show him off, and sent him on the most menial of errands. Luckily, Vittoria's cakes and biscuits were considered the best in town. The Bond Street butler came to the shop several times a week. Simon relished any opportunity to study him. Tearing his eyes away from the commotion in the cafe, Simon peered through the window for a glimpse of his father, among the many shelves and stacks of books. Finding no sign of him, Simon slowly let himself in the door and scurried to the back of the store, where a wrought-iron spiral staircase led to the family quarters. Safely ensconced in his room, Simon flopped himself into a chair at his workbench, a thick plank of sturdy mahogany that blended with the rest of the room's furnishings. His father had installed it a few years before, when it became apparent that Simon would never again pick up his flute. The much-hated instrument now sat in its case on a corner of the workbench. No matter how many times Simon threw it in the wardrobe, the maid would find the instrument and place it in what Vittoria had deemed a place of honour. There it sat, its presence pricking at Simon until he threw the case under the bed, wishing he could just get rid of it, but knowing he could never live without it. Simon let his gaze wander over the rest of his workbench, spanning the full length of one wall. It was littered with all manner of odd bits and failed experiments, gears and tools scattered about, tumbling over mechanical frogs and mice. Here and there, tiny emeralds and rubies glittered out of the frozen eye sockets in the afternoon light. Vittoria disapproved of the clutter, but Simon thought the organized chaos helped his creative process and refused to let the maid clean it. A small section under the window had been cleared for his current project, and it was here Simon's gaze finally came to rest. A small clockwork bird, vaguely resembling a sparrow, rendered in copper and brass, waited patiently to take flight. Simon had painstakingly assembled the small creature over the past weeks, out of parts scourged from the previous experiments, and, in the case of a few of the larger copper gears, from the trash of the Duke of Privy Lane, who had created the butler the Duchess of Bond Street was so very proud of. Parts of that could not be salvaged which had been crafted by Simon himself, such as the jointed legs and beak and tiny mechanical heart. He hoped would power the whole experiment when it was complete. But that was later. Simon had nearly finished with the project, despite the week lost figuring out the golden heart. It had turned out gold was the key. He had nearly given up before figuring that out. Multiple copies of the heart in bronze and copper were scattered among his other failures. Then yesterday had been spent searching through the trash can in his oldest, most tattered clothing, for it would not do to have an honorable be seen dumpster diving. His sister would never survive the shame. Not this time. He had needed only a few small pipes and gears, as well as scraps of copper sheeting to manufacture the remaining feathers for the wing and tail. But all his pocket money for the month had gone to the jeweler for the gold. The trash cans had been a desperate last resort. While working, Simon let his mind drift where it would. He had found crafting and acid etching the intricate feather design surprisingly easy and rather enjoyable. Bring up his mind to wander where it would, his hands busy, he found himself thinking back to that fateful fall and the event that had changed his life. 4 years ago, Simon had been a celebrated young musician. Newspapers all over the empire had lauded him as a child prodigy, the 9-year-old with a talent that made the angels weep. He had played before kings and visiting dignitaries, before finally receiving the invitation that would mark the highest point in his young life. He was to play for the emperor of the known world himself. His father was beyond proud, and Simon even caught Vittoria bragging to a group of her beaux about Simon's great accomplishment. Simon spent every spare second practicing. In the week leading to his concert, he was allowed to miss school so as to perfect his performance. But no matter how much he practiced, Simon could not quell the butterflies in his stomach, for this would be no measly king of a province the size of a postage stamp, who had earned his office by virtue of making the perfect cream puff. Nor would it be one of the many honorary dukes to be found here in London. With this one performance, Simon could become a duke himself, should he suitably please the emperor. When the day of the concert arrived, Simon dressed carefully in his new suit, commissioned specially by his father for the occasion. He polished his shoes until they shone, not trusting a maid to do the job correctly. He even asked Vittoria to help him tame his hair into something more appealing than its normal nonsense. Simon had a horrible habit of running his fingers through it when he was stuck on a particularly difficult composition. As a result, it had a tendency to stick up in every direction possible. After all was in order, the Abbott family piled into the royal coach, and the copper horses took off at a steady clip for the palace. Standing off stage with his father as he wanted to take his spot in the ballroom, Simon felt the quiet kaleidoscope of butterflies in his stomach morph into a swarm of angry wasps. He listened with one ear to the much-accomplished Lady Wyndham, daughter of the Earl of Griffin Street, Duck Pond, as she performed a lively reel on the fiddle. His toes tapped of their own accord as he surveyed the ballroom. It seemed every important personage in the whole of London had come to the palace. A fortune in diamonds glittered in the candlelight. Spread here and there among the guests was the warm glow of copper statues, commissioned by the Empress to celebrate the recent victory in the American colonies, reintegrating them into the glorious empire. After his victory, the Emperor had made a grand tour of the newly subdued lands, and the London papers had been full of the wonders presented to him. The entire ballroom had been decorated with clockwork representations of some of the Emperor's favorite animals from the colonies. Next to Lady Wyndham, a buffalo grazed. Its great head moved forward and back, the only moving part, despite the gears and piping that made up the rest of the creature. The only moving part, despite the gears and piping, made up the rest of the creature. Overhead, an eagle in flight gleamed at the end of a cable, tethering it to the ceiling. Raccoons caught in mid-scamper up a copper tree trunk stood in a corner. Whatever moving parts they had stilled by springs that had wound down. His favorite was the great mountain lion, prowling the edge of the stage, although this too needed winding, as its swishing tail was slowly coming to a halt. As his turn to perform came and the herald announced his name, Simon found himself thinking he might very well faint, rather than serenade the gathered crowd. His father gave him a quick squeeze on the shoulder and a gentle nudge onto the stage. "You'll do fine," the Viscount of Market Street had whispered, pride in his only sun shining from his eyes. Determined not to disappoint his father, Simon stayed on his feet long enough to sketch a bow to the Emperor. And his guests, before collapsing gracelessly into the provided chair. Then, lifting his flute to his lips, Simon began to play. The piece Simon had chosen was one of his very own composition, an adventurous piece he had written it based on the news articles following the Emperor's grand victory tour. As the music flowed sweetly from his flute, Simon closed his eyes and forced down his nerves. So far he had done well. He had made himself relax and poured his heart into his music. In his mind's eye he could see the tapping feet of a raccoon, followed by the trill of the melody as they begged for bits of chocolate. There the melody soared, evoking images of the great eagle high over the mountains. But as the music built to its grand finale, a celebration of buffalo, which were reclaiming the prairie lands, Simon thought he heard whispers begin to fly around the room, and suddenly they started. There was silence once more. Wasps reclaimed their residence in Simon's stomach. A shrill scream brought everything to a stop. Simon's eyes flew open and darted around the room. Stopping on the statue of a buffalo grazing near where he sat, he gasped. What had begun the night as no more than a stationary masterpiece of copper and gold now regarded Simon with one of its glittering amber eyes. With its head lifted, Simon could see the great golden heart beating steadily in its chest. As Simon stared in wonder, the beast turned away to amble towards the doors, heedless of any important personages in the way. More screams broke Simon out of his daze. Overhead, the eagle fought against the cable that tethered it to the ceiling. In the corner of the room, raccoons scurried for anything shiny. One had managed to get its paws on a sapphire-encrusted pocket watch of the Black Baron of Graveyard Hollow. The murderous Baron looked much less scary with his wig askew as he chased the little thief around the ballroom. A newly awakened fox bristled and yipped at those who came too close. Most worrying to Simon, the mountain lion he had so admired earlier now stalked between him and the closest exit, its tail snapping back and forth in annoyance. A sharp rap at the door shocked Simon back into the present. "We missed you in the shop today," Victoria said, all business as she bustled into the room. With a wave of her hand, the gas lamps flared to life. Simon winced at the sudden light. "Did Father say anything?" "You know he never does. Not since you were hurt." Vittoria had come to stand behind him. Absently she picked up one of the failed experiments, a tiny replica of an elephant with emerald chips as eyes. The trunk was a series of gears so small that he had needed to steal her tweezers to set them. Simon had known his father wouldn't mention him disappearing yet again. The Vicomte blamed himself for being unable to stop the mountain lion from taking a swipe at Simon, although a timely bash to the head with a chair had likely saved Simon's life and sent the great cat off hunting easier prey. Father is probably drowning his guilt in some old manuscript again, thought Simon, feeling a bit guilty himself for the strained relationship that now existed between his father and himself. Simon, Vittoria was hesitant. Simon, you can't go on like this. We can't go on like this, everyone tiptoeing around and avoiding each other. We rely on you to help in the bookshop. You can't just hide away tinkering on these things. Simon put down the tiny gear he had been trying to replace on one of the wing joints and slumped in his chair. He had heard this many times before. I like these things, he said finally. I'm happy working on them. Vittoria laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. She well remembered the cloud of bleak despair that had followed Simon that first year after the incident at the palace. She had tried everything to cheer up her younger brother, but just as she had been about to throw in the towel and call in a specialist, Simon had started his experiments. Since then he had almost been normal. So although she might disapprove of him hiding himself in his room and skipping work in the shop, she couldn't forbid the one thing that made him happy. All right, she said softly, but Simon noted her voice and turned back to her normal, brisk tone. Tomorrow you will start working immediately after school. When the shop closes, then you may skip off and continue with your tinkering. Now finish up and get some rest. It'll be a long day tomorrow. After Vittoria had set down the elephant and once again left the room, closing the door softly behind her, Simon tried again to place the gear that would allow the wing to open and close. As he worked, he remembered the fallout from the palace. The event had been the scandal of choice for almost a fortnight. Simon was confined to his room, weak from blood loss. His forearm was heavily bandaged to prevent him reopening the bone-deep wounds inflicted by the mechanical cat as he had darted past to his father and safety. Newspapers took advantage of his absence from the public eye to deride him, calling him the Clockwork Sorcerer. Rumors flew of those nobles who had suffered bites, scratches, and broken bones from the animals Simon had brought to life. Some said the Emperor had suffered a nip from a prairie dog and was furious. Returning to school led to seemingly worse torture. Other students quickly picked up on the new nickname and taunted him with it any time he set foot outside the bookshop. Vittoria hid in shame as the family disgrace. While it had been over a century since the last public witch burning, it was still considered the height of vulgarity to practice magic, when one might use it in the comfort of one's home to light gas lamps. It was considered most uncouth to make such a public display of sorcery as bringing all the king's statuary to life. Simon had 4 parallel scars on his left forearm to permanently remind him. Then word filtered down of the king's new clockwork menagerie, filled with creatures that required no key to be turned on regular, but would imitate their distant colonial cousins at all hours of the day and night. Magic was suddenly something greatly desired. From the greatest sorcerer down to the lowest hedge witch, those with magical talents revealed themselves as they attempted to create their own living mechanicals. The Marquis of Woolly Way even managed to create a servant that lasted a full day before it disintegrated into pipes, springs, and gears. None of the others came even close to that. Suddenly Simon was once again in demand. Again the papers heralded him as the Clockwork Sorcerer, this time in awe rather than contempt. Orders came for him to bewitch everything from servants to a tiny bejeweled monkey for the Countess of Pembury Park. But try as he might, Simon could never repeat his feat. He had no idea what he had done to bring them to life the first time. So he experimented. He wrote many songs, tried every composition, but none of them worked, and his clients left unsatisfied. With a heavy heart, Simon had to concede failure, and so the once great child prodigy fell further into disgrace and finally obscurity. Simon dragged his mind back to the present as he nudged the last primary feather into place, hoping the tiny gears that moved each feather to allow for flight would hold. He had quite a bit of difficulty with the last one. Finally finished, the little bird shone softly in the light from the gas lamps. It was now after 2 a.m, and the house was quiet. Even his father would have put away his latest book and gone to bed around midnight. Simon stretched and massaged his muscles, stiff from many hours of bending over the workbench. When he could once again feel his feet, he retrieved his flute from under the bed and began to assemble it. This was the final part of each experiment, conducted only at night as his family slept, his guilty conscience only allowing the music to flow when there was no ears awake to hear it. As Simon began to play, he watched the little bird closely for signs of life, the smallest ruffle of feathers, the spinning of a copper gear, or the turn of its delicately crafted head. So intent was he that Simon could almost imagine the rise and fall of its chest. With a small snort, Simon closed his eyes and gave himself up to the music, imagining a flock of sparrows chirping and dancing on the wind. Not until the last note had faded fully away did Simon dare open his eyes and glance towards his workbench. The little bird watched him, its head cocked to the side. Then slowly it unfurled its wings and began to fly. So quoth this raven.